We carry our parents inside us, not only in our features, our gestures, or the sound of our laughter, but also in the invisible landscape of our inner world. For many, this inheritance is nourishing. For others, it is heavy, marked by wounds that echo into adulthood. And yet, there comes a moment in life when we are called to reconcile with the past. To forgive our parents is not simply to absolve them, it is to free ourselves. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is a conscious act of liberation, a declaration that we will not let yesterday dictate tomorrow. Today, I want to share with you 5 pathways toward this forgiveness, so that we may honor where we come from without being shackled by it. Forgiveness does not begin in pretending nothing happened. It begins in truth. To step onto the path of healing, we must first have the courage to name the wound for what it is. There is a temptation, often ingrained since childhood, to protect the image of our parents at all costs. For the child, the parent is a kind of deity, giver of life, source of nourishment, protector against the vast unknown of the world. To admit that this figure may also be the source of pain is almost unthinkable. So we repress, we bury, we minimize. We tell ourselves it wasn't that bad, or they did their best. And perhaps these statements carry a measure of truth, but when they are used to cover over wounds instead of to face them, they become a barrier to growth. The psyche, however, is not fooled. What is denied does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious, where it gathers weight, where it takes root and grows into patterns that live through us, often against our conscious will. A harsh word from a parent might turn into a lifelong suspicion that we are not good enough. A lack of warmth may become an insatiable hunger for approval from bosses, lovers, even strangers. An act of betrayal in childhood might resurface decades later as a difficulty trusting anyone at all. We may believe we left the past behind us, yet the past walks within us every step of the way. Imagine a boy who grew up in a house where his achievements were never acknowledged. He brings home a drawing from school, only to be met with silence or a distracted wave of the hand. Later, he wins a small prize, but his parents are too absorbed in their own troubles to notice. Decades later, he has become a man, a competent professional, a father himself. Yet inside there lingers a restless drive, a voice whispering, "You must prove yourself. You must achieve more. Maybe then you will finally be worthy." He may not consciously connect this voice to his childhood, but it directs his choices nonetheless, pulling him toward exhaustion, perfectionism, and despair. It is only when he pauses and admits, "I did not receive the nurturing I needed," that something shifts. The truth spoken aloud is not a condemnation of his parents, nor is it self-pity. It is a release from illusion, the first step toward freedom. We must understand that acknowledging the wound does not mean dwelling in it endlessly. There is a difference between truth and victimhood. The danger of denial is that it keeps us in bondage to a past we refuse to face. The danger of victimhood is that it chains us to the past by endlessly repeating its story. To acknowledge is not to remain trapped, but to illuminate. Think of it as turning on a light in a darkened room. Suddenly, the vague shapes and threatening shadows reveal themselves for what they are. We see the broken chair in the corner, the forgotten toys on the floor. The room is still messy, but no longer terrifying. So it is with the inner world. What was unspoken and denied becomes manageable once it is named. This act of naming is not easy. It requires courage, because to admit our pain is to touch the fragile parts of ourselves we have tried to armor. Many people resist it, fearing that acknowledgement will lead to disloyalty toward their parents. They worry, if I say I was hurt, does that mean I am betraying them? Does it mean I am ungrateful? But true gratitude and true love are not built upon lies. They are built upon the ground of reality. To say "I was wounded" is not to deny the love that may also have existed. It is to hold both truths together, love and hurt, care and neglect, blessing and wound. Life, after all, is always paradoxical, never simple. Consider another example, a woman who remembers her mother as overcritical, sharp with words, quick to find fault in even the smallest details. As a child, she longed to hear, "I'm proud of you," yet those words never came. As an adult, she notices that when a colleague offers constructive feedback, she feels a rush of shame far out of proportion to the situation. She avoids taking risks, fearing criticism that would echo her mother's voice. For years, she tells herself, "It doesn't matter, it made me stronger." But deep down she feels the hollowness. One day in therapy, she allows herself to say for the first time, "My mother's words hurt me. I needed acceptance, and I did not receive it." The sentence is simple, but the release is profound. In that moment, she ceases to fight against her own truth. That admission does not erase the years of criticism, but it breaks the spell of denial. From that place, forgiveness may eventually grow. Psychological research has long affirmed what the soul already knows, that suppressed emotion manifests in the body and the mind in subtle but destructive ways. Chronic stress, anxiety, difficulties in relationships, even physical illness often have roots in unacknowledged trauma. The act of naming the wound allows the psyche to integrate what was once split off. Jung wrote often of the shadow, that part of ourselves that we hide, repress, or deny. Our childhood pain often resides in this shadow, and until we bring it into the light, it continues to operate from the dark, shaping our lives in ways we do not understand. By acknowledging the wound, we take the first step toward integrating the shadow, toward becoming whole. But let us be clear, acknowledgement is not about blaming for the sake of blame. It is not about accusing our parents in a court of memory. It is about honesty with ourselves. To say, "I was neglected," is not necessarily to say, "My parents were monsters." It is simply to honor the reality of what was. Some parents failed out of ignorance, some out of their own unhealed wounds, some out of circumstances beyond their control. Whatever the reason, the effect on the child remains. Only when we admit the effect can we begin to transform it. There is also a profound dignity in this acknowledgement. The inner child, long silenced, finally feels seen. For years, that child may have cried in the dark, unheard and uncomforted. When as adults we finally say, "Yes, you were hurt and it mattered," we extend to ourselves the compassion we once longed to receive. This act of self-witnessing is itself a kind of forgiveness, the beginning of a gentler relationship with our own past. Forgiveness does not emerge from pretending the pain did not happen. That is repression, and repression is a prison. Forgiveness emerges when the truth is faced fully, when we have the courage to say, "This is what I endured, this is how it marked me, and this is what I choose to do with it now." Only then are we free to move forward, not shackled by denial, not defined by resentment, but standing in the clarity of reality. And in that clarity, forgiveness becomes possible, because it grows not from illusion, but from truth. As children, our first experience of the world is filtered through our parents. They are the figures who provide food when we are hungry, warmth when we are cold, and guidance when the unknown looms too large. To our young minds they appear as all-powerful, beings who seem to know everything and control everything, guardians who can banish the monsters under the bed or call down blessings with a single word. It is a natural illusion, for the child cannot survive without this projection of omnipotence. We cling to it because it provides safety, order, and a sense of certainty. But as we grow older, the veil begins to fall, and we are confronted with the unsettling truth. Our parents are not gods. They are human beings, shaped by their own limitations, their own unresolved wounds, and the scars left by generations before them. The journey of forgiveness requires us to step into this perspective, to see not the symbolic figure of mother or father in their idealized form, but the vulnerable and often frightened person behind the role. This recognition can feel like a betrayal of our childhood loyalty. We want our parents to remain larger than life because part of us still longs to be held by a perfect, unfailing protector. To let go of that fantasy can feel like standing alone in the wilderness without a guide. Yet if we do not allow ourselves to see them as human, we remain trapped in disappointment, forever comparing their actions against impossible ideals. Forgiveness begins not by excusing the harm they caused, but by relinquishing the myth that they were meant to be perfect. Imagine the story of a father who seemed distant, emotionally unavailable, his words few, his affection withheld. A child in such an environment naturally interprets his silence as a kind of rejection. I am not worth loving. I am invisible. This belief can burrow deep into the unconscious, shaping adult life, with feelings of inadequacy and an endless search for validation. Yet later, perhaps in adulthood, the child learns something unexpected, that this father grew up in a household where emotions were seen as dangerous, where vulnerability was mocked, where love was never expressed. His silence was not necessarily a deliberate rejection of his child, but the echo of his own unhealed wounds. He could not give what he never received. To see this does not mean we suddenly feel no pain. The hurt of emotional neglect remains real. The emptiness it left within us must still be acknowledged. But by recognizing the humanity of the parent, we begin to understand that their shortcomings were not always a judgment against us. They were in many ways symptoms of their own brokenness. This perspective softens the edges of our resentment. We see the tragic cycle: hurt people, often unknowingly, hurt others. And when we see that, a door opens, not to erase the past, but to loosen its grip on our hearts. So much of our suffering arises from our unconscious insistence that parents should embody archetypes. The mother as eternal nurturer, endlessly patient, endlessly loving. The father as protector, wise, unshakable, strong. These figures are not real human beings. They are symbols, expressions of deep psychological needs that live in the collective unconscious. When we project them onto our parents, we set them up for failure, for no mortal being can embody such perfection. To release them from these projections is not to deny the roles they play, but to free both them and ourselves from the tyranny of expectation. Consider the example of a woman who remembers her mother as unrelenting in her criticism, always pointing out flaws, never offering comfort. For years she carries this as a wound, and her anger burns hot. Yet one day she comes to know more of her mother's past, a childhood spent in poverty, ridiculed by her own parents, expected to work hard from an early age without acknowledgement or affection. Suddenly the woman understands that her mother's harsh words were not a deliberate attack, but the voice of her grandmother living on in her mother's mouth. It does not erase the pain of being criticized, but it reframes the meaning. It allows her to see her mother not as a monster, but as a woman repeating a pattern she herself was too wounded to escape. To see our parents as human is not to absolve them of responsibility. Adults are still accountable for the ways they wound others. But when we view them through the lens of compassion, we begin to notice the places where they tried, however imperfectly. Perhaps the father who seemed distant was also the one who worked long hours to provide. Perhaps the mother who criticized was also the one who made sure her children never went hungry. Their love may have been twisted, their expression of care flawed, but beneath it may have been the silent intention to protect and sustain. To recognize this complexity is to step into a mature perspective, one that holds both truth and grace. Psychology teaches us that we inherit more than just eye, color, or height from our parents. We inherit emotional patterns, coping mechanisms, even the unspoken anxieties that shaped their lives. These legacies reach back through generations. A parent's cruelty may be the echo of a grandparent's neglect. A parent's silence may be the residue of a family tragedy never spoken of. When we view our parents through this lens, we see that they, too, were caught in a web of fate, struggling under burdens not entirely of their own making. This does not excuse the pain they caused us, but it allows us to situate that pain within a larger story, one that is more tragic than malicious, more human than divine. There is a certain liberation in this recognition. If our parents were gods who failed, then we are forever the abandoned children of fallen deities. But if our parents were simply human beings, flawed and fragile, then we are free to take up our own lives without waiting for them to finally become perfect. We can release them from the impossible demand to be what they could not, and in doing so, we release ourselves from the endless cycle of disappointment. Forgiveness, then, emerges not as an act of forgetting or excusing, but as a conscious choice to see with clearer eyes. It is the decision to look at the person who hurt us and say, "You are not a god, you are not a demon, you are human. You carry your wounds as I carry mine, and while I cannot change the past, I can choose not to let your brokenness define my future." In that moment, the chains of resentment loosen, and we step into a wider freedom. There is a profound difference between saying, "What happened to me was not my fault," and "I now hold responsibility for how I carry it forward." To many, these words might appear to be two sides of the same coin, but in truth they mark a turning point in the journey of the soul. As children, we are powerless, subject to the circumstances into which we were born. We do not choose our parents, nor the conditions of our early lives. If neglect, harshness, or absence marked those formative years, then the fault lies not with the innocent child, but with the conditions that shaped the parent and the family. And yet, when we carry these wounds into adulthood, we reach a crossroads. Either we remain in the posture of the child, endlessly waiting for our parents to repair what was broken, or we step into maturity and claim the authority to heal ourselves. Forgiveness, in this sense, is not a dismissal of accountability. To say that what was done to us was wrong is essential. Without this acknowledgement, we fall into the trap of denial, excusing behaviors that left scars upon our souls. But once the truth is named, the question becomes, what will I do now with what has been given to me? If I continue to live only in the posture of blame, I hand my power back to those who wounded me. I remain tethered to their failures, defining my life in reaction to theirs. But if I accept responsibility, not for the origin of the wound, but for the way I choose to respond to it, I step into the fullness of my own adulthood. This distinction is not abstract philosophy. It is lived reality for countless people. Consider the example of a man whose mother was often emotionally volatile, swinging between affection and rage. As a child, he never knew what version of her would walk into the room, and so he grew up anxious, always on guard, always scanning the emotional weather. As an adult, he found himself repeating the same pattern, unable to relax, terrified of intimacy, and quick to to retreat at the first sign of conflict. For years he blamed his mother for his inability to trust others, and in one sense he was correct. Her inconsistency shaped his early nervous system. But in time he began to realize that to remain in blame was to keep her power alive inside him. It was only when he said, "I did not choose what happened to me, but I choose how to carry it now," that the real work of healing began. By seeking therapy, practicing mindfulness, and intentionally entering relationships where safety and consistency were possible, he began to rewire the patterns left in him. Responsibility, in this case, was not a punishment but a liberation. Develop. Mental psychology has shown us again and again that those who take ownership of their healing are more resilient and less likely to pass their wounds to the next generation. Cycles of trauma continue not simply because pain exists, but because pain is left unacknowledged and untransformed. A mother who was criticized may criticize her daughter. A father who was neglected may neglect his son. Yet when an individual says, "I will take responsibility for how this story continues in me," something shifts in the ancestral chain. They become not only the heir of suffering, but the bearer of transformation. In this way, responsibility becomes a sacred duty, not merely to ourselves, but to those who came before us and to those who will come after. There is often resistance to this idea. Many people feel that if they take responsibility for their healing, it somehow lessens the accountability of their parents. They fear that by shifting focus inward, they excuse the wrongs of the past. But the truth is that these two realities can coexist. It is possible to say, "What my parents did was harmful, and they bear responsibility for those choices," and also to say, "I now carry responsibility for what I do with this pain." One does not cancel the other. Rather, they create a wholeness of perspective. Blame without responsibility leads to stagnation. Responsibility without truth leads to denial. Both must be held together if we are to heal. Think of a woman who grew up with a father who abandoned the family when she was very young. His absence left her with questions that gnawed at her. Why wasn't I enough for him to stay? What was wrong with me? For years she blamed him for her feelings of inadequacy and her struggles in relationships. That blame was not unfounded. His absence was a choice that marked her life. But over time she came to see that clinging to blame was like holding a burning coal in her hand. It kept her pain alive, but it did not change the past. The turning point came when she said, "I could not control his leaving, but I can control how I define myself now. I am not the abandoned child anymore. I am the adult who chooses how to live." That shift from blame to responsibility was the beginning of her forgiveness, not because her father deserved absolution, but because she deserved freedom. This is the paradox of forgiveness. It does not erase accountability, but it releases us from captivity. It does not deny that harm was done, but it refuses to let that harm dictate the entirety of our story. Responsibility is the bridge between past and future. It is the recognition that while I did not plant the seed of pain, I can decide whether it will grow into poison or be transformed into wisdom. Taking responsibility is often misinterpreted as self-blame, but they are worlds apart. Blame says, "It was my fault that I was hurt." Responsibility says, "It was not my fault, but it is now my task to heal." Blame locks us in shame. Responsibility opens us to freedom. One constricts, the other empowers. One repeats the past, the other transforms it. Life always confronts us with this choice: remain in the posture of the wounded child, or rise into the stance of the conscious adult. The child waits endlessly for repair that may never come. The adult claims the authority to create healing, even if the parent never apologizes, even if they never change. This does not mean the wound disappears. It means the wound no longer rules us. In every human story, there comes a moment where the weight of blame becomes too heavy to carry. We reach the limit of resentment and realize that our bitterness does not punish those who hurt us. It only prolongs our suffering. It is then that responsibility emerges as a gift, by saying, "The past has shaped me, but it does not have to define me." We declare our independence from what was. We cease to be merely the children of our parents' mistakes and become the authors of our own becoming. Forgiveness in this light is not the end of the story but the beginning of a new one. It is the conscious act of saying, "I cannot change what was done, but I can decide how I carry it forward," and in that decision lies the possibility of freedom, healing, and transformation. Resentment is like carrying a burning coal in the palm of your hand, waiting for the moment it might finally scorch the one who wronged you. But the paradox is clear. It is your own flesh that burns, your own skin that blisters, while the one against whom the anger is directed may not even feel its heat. Resentment binds us, not them. It is the chain we wrap around our own hearts, convinced it is a weapon to control another. In truth, it is a prison of our own design. To release resentment is not to diminish the truth of what was done, nor is it to absolve another of their accountability. It is to recognize that the burden of bitterness weighs more heavily upon the one who carries it than upon the one who caused it. Often, resentment feels like loyalty. We hold on to it as if to say, "If I let this go, it will mean what they did didn't matter." The psyche clings to anger because it seems safer than grief. Anger feels active, fiery, protective, while grief feels like surrender, exposure, and loss. But in reality, clinging to anger is an unconscious form of loyalty to our suffering. It is as though we fear that letting go of resentment would betray the child we once were, the child who endured the wound. Yet forgiveness does not betray the child, it honors them. By releasing the bitterness, we are not saying it was acceptable. We are saying it hurt and it mattered, but it will no longer rule the course of my life. Consider the woman who lived for decades under the shadow of her mother's relentless criticism. Every choice she made was haunted by an inner voice repeating her mother's words, "You could have done better. You are not enough." At first, she believed that her anger toward her mother protected her from this voice. She thought, "If I stay angry, I won't let her win." Yet the opposite was true. The longer she clung to resentment, the louder the critical voice became. Her mother no longer needed to speak. Her inner dialogue carried on the work of her mother's tongue. When at last she began to release the bitterness, something remarkable happened. The voice began to quiet. In loosening her grip on resentment, she reclaimed her own mind. This story is not rare. Many of us know what it is like to rehearse old arguments in the privacy of our thoughts, to imagine what we would say if we finally confronted those who wronged us. We relive conversations that never happened, sharpening our words like weapons. Yet the other person remains unaffected, going about their life, while we are the ones who suffer sleepless nights, tension in our bodies, and bitterness in our hearts. In this sense, resentment is not only a burden but also a kind of possession. It possesses the mind, crowding out joy and peace, repeating old injuries as if they were fresh. To forgive is to perform an act of exorcism, not of forgetting, not of condoning, but of reclaiming one's inner space from the grip of bitterness. Forgiveness must not be confused with passivity. It is not to say, "What you did was acceptable," or "It did not matter." Rather, forgiveness declares, "I will not let your actions define who I am anymore." It is a radical assertion of sovereignty over one's own psyche. When we forgive, we take back authority over the story of our lives. We no longer allow the voices of the past to dictate our identity. We no longer define ourselves solely as victims of what was done. Instead, we stand as agents of our own becoming. Psychologists and healers have long observed that resentment, when left unresolved, manifests physically as well as emotionally. Studies link chronic anger and bitterness to stress-related illnesses, weakened immune systems, and cardiovascular disease. The body quite literally keeps the score, carrying the weight of unresolved pain. In this way, forgiveness is not only a spiritual or emotional act, but a profoundly physical one. To let go of resentment is to unburden the body as well as the mind, to release energy that has been trapped in cycles of anger and grief. But how does one release resentment when the wound feels so deep, when the injustice feels unforgivable? The process is not instantaneous. It requires patience and compassion for oneself. Often, the first step is to grieve. Beneath anger lies sorrow. The sorrow of not having received what we needed, the sorrow of being hurt by those we trusted most. Resentment protects us from touching this grief, but only by moving through grief can we loosen resentment's grip. To weep for what was lost, to mourn what never was, is to cleanse the wound so it can finally heal. Letting go also involves seeing the one who hurt us in their humanity, not to excuse them, but to contextualize their behavior. To understand that their cruelty or neglect was often the echo of their own unhealed wounds allows us to soften, not in the sense of minimizing what they did, but in the sense of refusing to let their pain dictate ours. We recognize that the chain of suffering did not begin with us and need not continue through us. Imagine again the burning coal in the hand. To drop it does not mean the fire ceases to exist, but it means we no longer choose to carry it. Forgiveness is the act of opening the hand, releasing the coal, and allowing it to fall away. The heat remains in memory, the scars may still be visible, but the fire no longer consumes us. In the end, resentment is a tether to the past, a cord that binds us to those moments of hurt. Forgiveness is the severing of that cord. It is the declaration that while the past shaped us, it does not own us. By releasing resentment, we make space for something new, peace, compassion, even joy. We discover that forgiveness was never primarily for the other person. It was always for ourselves. It is the key that unlocks the prison we unknowingly built around our own hearts. And when we step outside that prison, we find that life, in all its fullness, is still waiting for us. The final step of forgiveness is not merely release, but transformation. If we stop only at letting go of resentment, we risk leaving the wound as an empty space, a hollow scar with no further meaning. But life, in its deepest wisdom, calls us to take what has hurt us and use it as fuel for growth, to allow suffering to be transmuted into something that nourishes instead of destroys. The alchemists of old spoke of turning lead into gold, of transforming base matter into radiant essence. The psyche performs a similar alchemy when it takes the heavy lead of pain and transmutes it into the gold of wisdom. This is not an act of denial, it is an act of transcendence. Many of the most compassionate souls we know are those who have walked through the fire of suffering. They are tender not because life was always tender with them, but because they chose to let their wounds soften their hearts instead of hardening them. Some of the most loving parents are those who once stood in the dark silence of neglect and vowed with quiet determination, "I will not repeat what I suffered. My children will not carry this burden." In that vow, the wound is not erased, but it becomes a teacher. It becomes a source of awareness, reminding them each day of what was missing and awakening the will to provide it for others. Think of the adult who once felt abandoned, who knows intimately the ache of loneliness and the terror of being unseen. That same adult may one day dedicate themselves to creating communities where no one feels alone, where every voice is heard. What was once a scar becomes a wellspring of empathy. What once was a cry of despair becomes a song of connection. Their pain has not vanished, but it has been given meaning, and meaning has the power to redeem even the most difficult past. To transform a wound into wisdom is to honor it as part of the story of the soul. Our culture often tells us to hide our scars, to cover over the imperfections that remind us of vulnerability, but in truth it is the scar that tells the deeper story. A healed scar says, "I was hurt, but I survived. I was broken, but I mended." It becomes a testament not only to suffering, but to endurance. And endurance itself contains wisdom, for it teaches us the resilience of the human spirit. One of the deepest insights of psychology is that the very places we are most wounded can become the very places through which our greatest gifts emerge. A child silenced by dismissive parents may grow into an adult who gives voice to others through art or advocacy. A child who grew up amidst conflict may devote themselves to peacemaking. A child who never felt safe may spend their adulthood creating sanctuaries of safety for others. The pattern repeats itself endlessly. The broken places, if brought into awareness and transformed, become channels of light. What was once only darkness becomes a doorway through which compassion enters the world. Yet this transformation does not happen automatically. Many wounds remain raw. Many lives become defined by bitterness rather than growth. The difference lies in choice, the choice to turn toward the pain, to ask what it has to teach, to wrestle with it until it yields some fragment of meaning. It is not an easy process. It requires courage to face the wound instead of fleeing from it, and patience to wait while it slowly reveals its lessons. But those who persist often find that the very suffering they once thought would break them becomes the foundation of their strength. To forgive our parents is to recognize that while their actions shaped us, they do not have to define us. The past cannot be erased, but it can be redeemed. Redemption comes when we use what happened not as a weight that drags us down, but as soil in which new life can grow. The very thing that once threatened to suffocate us can, if tended with care, become fertile ground for wisdom, compassion, and depth of character. Consider again the alchemical image, the lead of pain transformed into the gold of understanding. The process requires heat, pressure, and time. In the same way, our inner transformation often comes through struggle, through sitting with discomfort, through refusing to let suffering be meaningless. When we look back on our lives with honesty, we may find that the experiences which wounded us most deeply also awakened in us the qualities we value most highly: strength, empathy, perseverance, the ability to connect with others in their pain. This does not make the wound good in itself. No child deserves neglect or cruelty, but it does mean that nothing is wasted, not even suffering. Life, in its strange and paradoxical way, can take what was meant for harm and use it for good. There is immense power in declaring, "I will make something of this. I will not let it end with me." When we do this, we break cycles that may have stretched through generations. We become a turning point in the ancestral story, the one who refuses to pass the wound forward untransformed. In this sense, forgiveness is not simply a private act. It is a generational act. It alters the trajectory of those who come after us. Children raised by a parent who has transformed their wound inherit not the raw pain of the past, but the wisdom distilled from it. In this way, healing spreads outward, rippling through families and communities. It is tempting to believe that transformation is something dramatic, a grand moment of enlightenment or sudden change. But more often it is quiet and gradual. It is found in the small choices, choosing patience when anger arises, choosing to listen instead of repeating old patterns, choosing to speak words of affirmation when silence or criticism would be easier. Each of these choices, made again and again, gradually reshapes the inheritance of pain into a legacy of love. Forgiving our parents does not erase the past. The scars remain and the memories linger. But forgiveness allows us to reinterpret those scars, to tell a new story about what they mean. Instead of monuments to victimhood, they become symbols of survival and transformation. Instead of chains binding us to resentment, they become seeds of empathy planted in the soil of our lives. In this way, suffering itself is redeemed. It is not that the hurt never happened, but that we have chosen to make something of it, to create meaning from the ashes. When we allow our wounds to become wisdom, we discover a strange and paradoxical freedom. The very places that once felt like sources of shame become sources of connection with others. The very experiences that once isolated us become bridges of empathy, and the very pain that once threatened to destroy us becomes the wellspring of our strength. In this transformation, forgiveness finds its highest expression, not as denial, not as mere release, but as transcendence. Through it, we step into a deeper wholeness, no longer defined by the failures of the past, but defined by the meaning we have drawn from them. To forgive your parents is to step into the fullness of your own adulthood. It is to say, I honor where I come from, but I am no longer bound to it. It is to let go of bitterness, not because they always deserved forgiveness, but because you deserve freedom. Forgiveness is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new one.